潔いち俺はストライカーだ
With Blue Lock being the competitive show that it is, I think it's only natural for the community to gravitate towards putting one player against another. I mean, I made my whole channel on the premise of this idea. I love putting one player against another. That's just the best way to experience such a competitive show. However, one idea regarding this topic that I kept on seeing in the comments was actually me doing a ranking of every player in Blue Lock. And I've always strayed from a video like this because I feel like it undermines the work I put in my matchups. I feel like the matchups we could get from Blue Lock are much bigger than putting all of them in a singular video. And so I've never done this idea. However, and because I kept on seeing a lot of comments on this topic specifically, I could not get it out of my head. And so after much consideration, I came up with a perfect solution, where instead of blatantly ranking each player and where they fall, I am going to do a tier list, with each tier holding multiple players. That way we can get a general sense of who is better than the other. However, at the same time, the craziest matchups would be on the same tier. And so not only would I satisfy you guys with a ranking, but also it would make it very easy for me to explain why I put certain players in matchups while I ignore other players. For example, the reason I've never done Hiyori versus Sai is because I felt Hiyori is always a little bit far behind Sai. He is not on his tier, nor is he close for me to do a matchup. But at the same time, whenever I do a matchup between certain players, it usually means they are on the same tier or are very close to each other. And honestly, an all-encompassing tier list would be the perfect video to end 2025 with. And so without any further ado guys, I give you Blue Lock's ultimate tier list. Now, to start the video, I gotta say that I split the players into 9 tiers. From the best among the pros down to what the hell are you even doing still in Blue Lock? And it goes without saying that I've excluded every player that got eliminated. Instead, we will be keeping only the players that matter. And so, let's start from the bottom. Let's start from the worst tier of players in Blue Lock currently. These are the players that I honestly wonder why the hell are they still even relevant. And I feel like the perfect player to start with is none other than Nagi. He is honestly the definition of average, and the only reason he survived is because he leached from Ren. And it's not even the case of him just relying on another player. He actually did nothing to further Ren's playing style, and the latter ended up ditching him because he was not much of a help. And so I feel like he only succeeded because Nagi got lazy, and for that reason I honestly believe he is at the bottom of this tier list. However, next to him is a more interesting player, Fukaku Gen. Now, in all honesty, this is not Fukaku's fault. Goalkeepers suck in Blue Lock with the exception to Gagamaru, and unfortunately, Fukaku is no different. Hell, the only time where he could have gotten his chance in the Uber's game, he actually got completely forgotten by the writer. And so he is here not because he is bad or anything, but because we don't know much about him, nor do we actually need to care about him. He is just here because the World Cups need at least 2 goalkeepers. And so for that reason, I think he fits in this tier. However, he is actually the last one on it. I feel like these are the only 2 players that I honestly sometimes think what the hell they are even doing here. However, next we have average U20 players. These are not bad by any means, but at the same time, I don't feel like they are great or anything. And this does not mean that they do not deserve their spot here. They are still better than most the fodder we've seen in the NEL. And I feel like the perfect player to start this tier with is none other than Sendo. The guy is the shittiest striker in Blue Lock, and for a good reason. He cannot turn a guaranteed pass given to him by Sai into a goal even when he is completely free. I mean, the defense of Blue Lock in that specific moment was completely open, yet Sendo was not able to take a good shot. He did not even try to trap and then shoot with all of his might. Instead, he opted for a direct shot that Gagamaru stopped very easily. And then even in the Uber's game, I think his whole playing style revolved around assisting Baro. However, this is specifically why I feel he does not deserve to be in the lowest tier, because I feel like he at least contributed to something, and at the end of the day, he scored scored a goal. And so I feel like he is definitely better than the fodder we've seen in the NEL. Still not that great, but also not that bad. In the same boat, however, I have Zantetsu, which honestly hurts me to put him here. This is one of my favorite characters in the show for some reason. I just love the idea of someone who does not understand the basics of things being completely dominant. However, that's not what the writer intended for him, and he ends up being a very average player. Well, average by Blue Lock's terms. And honestly, what can I tell you guys? I think Zantetsu has one of the biggest wasted potential in Blue Lock. The guy is one of the fastest players, with what's probably the fastest acceleration in Blue Lock, yet unfortunately he amounts almost next to nothing. The only few feats he had in the PXG game were all thanks to Karasu's brain, and all he did was follow him to a T. And so once more, I don't think he is great by any means, but at the same time, I don't think he is that bad. However, next to Zantetsu, we have Isegi's right-hand man, Kuruna Renze. Now, this might sound weird to you guys. How is Kuruna this low when he is very helpful to Isegi? Well, in fact, I think him being over-reliant on Isegi is the reason why he is here. All he does is leech off of Isegi and nothing more. He never goes for his own play, he is never threatening beyond what Isegi can pull off from him, and he amounts to nothing more. And I feel like much like Zantetsu, he is completely wasted. He has one of the coolest speed stats in the show, yet unfortunately against the strong players, he amounts to almost nothing. And also I know that he is much better than Sendo. However, Sendo's mentality is leagues ahead. Sendo at least went for his ideas, and that's the reason why I think he closed the gap between him and Kuruna, despite Sendo being complete shit. But the next and final player on this list as well is actually none other than Kiora. Now, much like is the case with Sendo, Kiora's pass to Kaza was honestly insane. He was able to utilize Isegi to even trick PXG. However, that's about it with Kiora. The guy has no other feat to speak with other than somehow limiting Shido's freedom, which judging by how things went, I feel like he was not able to stop him whatsoever. I mean, he is not complete shit, but at the same time, I don't feel anything special from Kiora. As I said, one pass is not enough for him to be that scary, and so he is the final player in the tier list of regular U20 players. But next, we have the tier list of actually good players. And here, I feel like we only have 4 players, and the first among them, I know he is going to infuriate a lot of you guys. Of course, I'm talking about Gagamaru. I know, a lot of you guys are coming towards me with pitchforks. However, hear me out. As I said, goalkeepers don't typically matter, and I feel like Gagamaru only gets feats when the plot requires it. When the writer wanted Baru to evolve, he made Gagamaru be able to stop him. When the writer wanted to push Onazi and Nigeria losing them miserably, the writer presented Gagamaru as the ultimate ace. However, in most cases, much like any goalkeeper in Blue Lock, Gagamaru receives all sorts of goals. And for that reason, and because the writer doesn't really care about the goalkeepers, I feel like Gagamaru sits perfectly in this tier. Now, mind you, this is not a bad tier by any means. This is the tier for really good players. However, I don't think they deserve to be among the elite U20 players. However, next I actually have 2 players that I would like to talk about at the same time, which are Aryu and Nico. They both are great defenders and they both are trying their best. And hell, they are even both dominant in their respective field. Aryu is very dominant in the air and Nico is very perceptive on the ground. And so I feel like they represent this tier perfectly. They are far ahead of the fodder we've seen in the NEL, and they are far ahead of regular U20 players. But at the same time, I cannot place him any higher because they lack that flair and that push from the writer that would take them to the next step. However, the final player in this list is actually one of the newest, which is none other than Kuso. I feel like I had so much hype for this guy only for him to fumble the ball completely. He went from a very interesting character to just someone who tries to push Onazi and he is not even good at that. Blue Lock still was far ahead of him thanks to Isegi, Karasu and Aiko's thinking. And so for that reason, I feel like he sits perfectly here. However, with that, let's actually move to the next tier, which is where the video really starts. These players are actually the real deal. And so let's start immediately with the assassin Karasu Tabito. Now, to be honest, I feel like Karasu sits at the very top of this tier, and he is just few weapons away from actually ascending. However, this does not take anything away from him. He is still a very good U20 player. He is not among the best, obviously, but at the same time, he is way higher and much better than most other players in the U20 category. In the same boat as Karasu, I feel like I have two other players who are at the very top of this tier, which are Ryo and Aiku. Now Aiku is almost the same as Karasu. I feel like they are almost on the same level, not only with their meta vision or field readability, but in their overall skill. And actually a matchup between these two would be very fun to do. However, Ryo is also here, and I feel like the only reason he is at the very top and not in the next tier is because of his mentality. I am still not sure of how well Ryo is mentally. I mean, sure, he looks good right now, but what would happen when he sees Nagi? And so for that reason, and despite me thinking that his talent should be higher, I think due to that mentality he sits comfortably next to Aiku and Karasu. But moving on to the next player in this list, we have Hiyori Yo, probably the best forward midfielder in Japan after Sai Itoshi. The guy has insane genetics and talent for football, but also he is one of the coolest players and one that I actually like a lot. And the only reason he is not higher, I feel like, is because the writer kinda forgot about him. He was great in the Ubers game. I mean, he was even able to bamboozle Lorenzo. Yet after that, in the PXG game, he was not as great. But the final blow actually came in the Nigerian game. With the exception to his first assist to Rin, Hiyori actually amounted next to nothing in that game. And so that's the reason why I can't place him a tier higher. However, and speaking of the Nigerian game, I actually have two players. One who is at the top of this tier and the other being at the very bottom. Of course, I'm talking about Onazi and Ubo. Onazi actually showed insane promise, and he is definitely one of the great strikers we've seen, but I don't feel like his performance would allow him to be among the elites, especially since he actually did not score. And as we've learned from Baro and Isigi, even if you are insane and a broken player, not scoring means that you are not that great. As for Obo, I think he was very impressive. I mean, Bachua and Ryo were still able to score right in his face, despite them both not using very OP shooting abilities. However, I still think that he performed somewhat good, especially against Ren. Granted that he was in flow, but that does not take a lot from him, and so for that reason he is in this tier, albeit at the bottom. But next, and carrying out with foreign players, we have Alexis Ness. Now, to be honest, the Ness that we've seen at the end of the PXG game honestly would be one or even two tiers higher than this. However, that's not his current level. For all we know, that could be a fluke, and so until he reproduces that level, I cannot place Ness any higher. But again, this is not a bad or even an average tier. These are great U20 players. I mean, just look at the players we have here. Speaking of which, let's actually move to the next two seats, which are taken by the former members of the top 6 of Blue Lock. I'm talking about Otoya and Yuki. Now, as you all know, I've already made a matchup between Karasu, Otoya and Yuki, and in that video, Karasu definitely won. However, this is what I am talking about. They are on the same tier even if Karasu is better than them. And even if I think Otoya is slightly better than Yuki, I think they're still very close to each other and they deserve their spot in this tier. But next, we have a player who I think do not deserve his place here, and he deserves to be much higher if the writer did not forget about him. Of course, I'm talking about none other than Chigiri Hiyoma. His performance in the Bastard game was honestly top tier and would have easily placed him in the next tier. But as we all saw in the other games, he was not that impressive, especially the last game against FC Barca. Despite FC Barca having relatively weak defense, he was not actually able to do much except that one time that Rio fed him a great pass. And this is what I'm talking about. I feel like the writer completely forgot about him, and so for that reason I cannot place him any higher. And of course, because I placed Chigiri Hiyoma here, you already know that the next player is definitely Kunigami Rensuke. Now, to be honest, I was going to place Kunigami a tier lower, next to Aryu, especially after getting dominated by him. However, his somewhat impressive feat of stopping Shido for like 15 or 20 minutes is still very admirable, and so for that reason he deserves his place in this tier. And actually, speaking of a guy who can jump very high, the next and final player on this list is none other than Agi. Now, to be honest, I feel like we did not see Agi's full potential. He was way focused on Nagi and on Kaiser for him to actually pull off his best game. And so I cannot in good conscience place him any higher despite us not actually knowing his full potential. All I can say that I think he is very strong of a player, but I don't think it is enough for him to crack open the next tier. Speaking of which, moving on to insane U20 players. These are the 4 players that I think are knocking on the door of the new Gen 11s. And so who are these legends? Well, let's start the list with the MVP of the Nigerian game, Bachira Meguru. Now Bachira ironically is one of the most consistent consistent players throughout Blue Lock. Ever since his awakening in the second selection, Bajra consistently scored and he consistently was great asset to any team, not only in scoring as I just said, but also in playmaking and actually giving the team an edge over the opponent. And even in the most recent game, we've seen him completely dominate, having 3 assists and a goal. That's actually a very insane performance and would only be topped by a player scoring 3 goals. And for this level of consistency and this level of talent and his insane ability to dribble, I think Bajra is definitely knocking on the door of the new Gen 11, which could be said about the French imp. Now, what can I even start with this guy? I feel like him being better than Sai at passing should tell you everything about him. And a disclaimer before anyone says it, yes, we don't know the extent of Sai's passing, but from what we've seen, Charles is definitely better in terms of passing as of right now. Of course, he doesn't compare to him in a lot of other aspects, but one where I think he actually does is actually his vision as well. He actually is a player who outread both Isigi and Kaiser multiple times, and so I feel like that alone would give him bragging rights that he is knocking on the new Gen 11 door. And of course, him also having an insane passing ability goes a long way. But next, I feel like we need to talk about these two together. Of course, I'm talking about Shido and Baro, because I feel like these are the closest players to the new Gen 11s. However, they still did not crack it for one reason or another. And I feel like their perfect position is definitely in this tier. And honestly, they kinda explain this tier perfectly. They are definitely very close to Isigi's level and can rival him in scoring. However, they fall short a little bit behind Isigi for them to reach the next tier. Speaking of which, next we have the new Gen 11 tier. And immediately I gotta present 3 players who are obviously new gens that represent what this tier is all about. Of course, I'm talking about Kaiser and Lorenzo, but also I am talking about Hugo. Now, for Hugo, we don't actually know. For all we know, he could be better, he could be worse. I am leaning towards him being better, but for right now, he is just a placeholder. But the other two are actually the epitome of what they do. Lorenzo, of course, is the best defender in the U20 category hands down, and so he deserves that spot. As for Kaiser, he is one of the best pure strikers in the entirety of the U20 category. Actually, I feel like he is the best, and he is only rivaled by one player, which is Isegi Yoichi, who, as a lot of you may have noticed, I am placing him in the new Gen 11 tier, which I feel like it is pretty deserving for him. He was able to beat Kaiser on multiple occasions and was able to live rent-free inside of his head. And so for that reason, he definitely deserves to be on this tier, which could be said about Ren Itoshi, whom doesn't really mirror Kaiser but actually mirrors Lorenzo. I feel like in the NEL, the best individual players were actually both Lorenzo and Ren. They are both obviously dominant in their own way, with Lorenzo being extremely great at defending while also being very oppressive in offense, and then Ren being the exact opposite, being extremely successful on attack, but at the same time he is very great at defending as well, and so he is too deserving of being on this tier. And by now I think it's time for me to address the very problematic thing that I've just done, which is actually making a new gen tier while excluding Bunny, Sai or Loki. However, that's all because the next tier is actually New Gen Plus. These are New Gen 11 players, which means they are at the top of the U20 game. However, instead of just remaining on the top, they actually reach the professional level. And in the case of Bunny, he is actually very dominating in that. I know Kaiser is not a pro right now, but in chapter 4 it was said that he would have become pro if it wasn't for the Spanish regulations of how a foreign minor cannot sign any contract. And this definitely means that if he could, Sai would have definitely become a pro. And he did that at Real of all clubs, meaning if it wasn't for the regulations, he would be playing next to Luna. However, that's all for this tier. And I know what you are saying, where is Loki? Well, I feel like he is not just a U20 player that went pro, he is definitely much more than that. However, before we reach Loki, we gotta go for the second best tier on our list, which is the tier of the Oppressive pros. These are insane pros, since Ego himself handpicked them for this program, and so they are by no means akin to the other pros. Instead, they are insane pros that are very high on the professional level. And I feel like the perfect way to kick off this tier is actually by presenting a rivalry between Luna and Levi. You see, these two are the princes of their own clubs. As for why they are oppressive, I feel like we can very easily quantify Levi. However, Luna is a bit tricky and we might be required to compare him to Levi, whom we've seen him completely destroy a U20 team. And so for that reason, I feel like he fits perfectly in this tier. He is a very oppressive pro that beats almost everyone except for the elites of Blue Lock. But of course, if we say that Luna is his current rival, that would put him roughly on the same tier, and so he is there as well. As for the others, next I have Blake. Now, to be honest, if it wasn't for a certain player, Blake would definitely be a tier high. You see, he is very dominant physically, and that actually enabled him to be the top scorer of the Premier League, which is actually much harder than what meets the eyes, especially because Chris Prince was very active in the same year, meaning Blake was even able to beat Chris Prince in terms of dominance. However, I don't think this grants him a passage to the next tier, because I feel like him being the top scorer of the Premier League is actually a double-edged sword. It means that of course he dominated, but at the same time, even with that dominance and that performance, he was not called up as the second place after Noah in the Ballon d'Or ranking. This obviously could mean that Prince was a much better player, and also he might be just 1 or 2 goals behind Blake, and in any other aspect he actually dominates Blake. And so after all of that happened, I think the perfect tier for Blake is definitely here. He is not among the best yet. And of course this goes for the other 2 pros, because I feel like the writer is actually putting them on the same level as Luna and Blake. And so for that reason I feel like they fit here perfectly. However, with them actually out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the cream of the pie, the best of the best baby. And here I have 4 players. 2 I actually already alluded to, which are Prince and Loki. Now, Prince is obviously here because he is the second best player in the eyes of FIFA, and that definitely means something. He beat all the other players in terms of ranking, and so he is definitely among the best. As for Loki, I feel like I can't talk about him without actually talking about Noah, who is obviously in this tier. You see, Noah is the best in the eyes of FIFA, and it actually was by a great margin, which means he is the most dominant player right now. And at the same time, this oppressive player is actually praising Loki and saying that he is the closest to him, meaning that he is definitely also among the best. He is on that league and he is trying to be the best in the world. And then the final player on this tier, and probably on the whole list, is none other than Mark Snuffy. And honestly, I'm not going to say anything about Mark Snuffy. You all know what he can do, and you all know how dominant he is and why he is the true #1 player in Blue Lock. And so him being in the best tier is just a given. And so with that, these are all the tiers we have. And that's the list for you guys. Or that's what I would say if we didn't have a lazy genius. You see, despite me going through almost everyone, I did not cover Nagi. However, that's for a good reason. You see, Nagi before with his laziness would be maybe on the tier of Ario or Nico. Maybe he goes a tier higher next to Karasu when he pulls off his insane stunts, but overall he was not great whatsoever in the NEL. On the other hand, now that he fixed his mentality, I have no doubt that he can jump few ranks. And for that reason, I am going to put him on the same tier as Baro. And remember, I'm talking about Nagi with his motivation being fully on. However, with us actually finishing with Nagi and we put him in the most fitting tier, that's the list for you guys. That's the ultimate tier list of Blue Lock. And so when it goes without saying, what do you guys think about this? Did I do the tier justice or did I botch it completely? Please let me know in the comments. However, with that, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, thank you for watching.